So I'm Samantha Woods. I'm the project manager for the Saving Saffron Brook project, which is it's a partnership project running with Trent Rivers Trust and a whole series of community-based partners, including Nature Spot. And we are working under some funding from DEFRA through the Green Recovery Challenge Fund to try to restore the heavily modified saffron brook. So saffron brook is, for anybody who's not familiar with it, it starts up in Oadby area and runs through the golf course and the race course in Oadby, down through Knighton Park, and then down through Knighton and Ayleston and the saffron areas, where it joins the Soar down by Hewenden Drive in Ayleston. It's an area of the River Soar that has been heavily modified over the years as a result of sort of flood intervention measures. And what we're trying to do is to restore the natural environment around the river, to restore the river to a more natural meander where we can make interventions, and also to encourage people to connect with the river throughout its course, and to connect with the wildlife along the banks of the river and within the river channel itself. So we're running a whole series of community engagement activities. The funding runs out in March 2023, but we're hoping that there will be a huge legacy from this of connecting people with the natural environment in the urban setting of Leicester and through Oadby and Wigston. So we're really excited to be working with Nature Spot. We will be kind of adding habitat as part of the project. So we're going to be looking at increasing the amount of woodland, the amount of grassland habitat, but also repairing footpaths and allowing more access to the river in certain places. We've already started doing some work, particularly in Knighton Spinney. So a lot of work was done by the volunteer teams going out in the winter and clearing brambles and non-native geraniums from Knighton Spinney, which is one of the few bits of sort of older woodland that still exist in the city. And that work has really allowed the native wildflowers within the spinney, particularly the wood anemones that are flowering at the moment, to be able to come to the surface and actually flower. And if you have a chance to go to Knighton Spinney at the moment, well, you will do if you sign up for Saturday's session, you'll be able to see what impact the volunteer teams have had in sort of opening up light to the ground to allow the native wildflowers to come through. So the 100 Species Challenge is something that we're really pleased to be supporting Nature Spot with. We're really trying to encourage people to connect with wildlife across the city, and particularly in the catchment. And it's a really exciting opportunity for people to develop their wildlife identification skills, but also to come out and to connect with the environment and the natural world around Leicester. So thank you so much, Dave, for inviting me to do this introduction. If anybody would like to know more about the Saffron Brook project, please just contact us through the contacts that you've got for signing up for this, and watch out for our future events. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Sam. Yeah, so just to quickly add that the 100 Species Challenge is kind of, I suppose, the latest project that we've developed at Nature Spot in conjunction, as you've heard, with Saving the Saffron Brook. We try and generally give a lot of help to people to identify species. And I know some of you are familiar with our website, but if you're not, then do have a look. And I really encourage you to, if you would like to get a little bit more involved, to join the 100 Species Challenge. It's slightly more difficult than the 100 species indicates, because it has to draw from 10 different wildlife groups. So, if you're just into birds or butterflies, for example, you can't kind of clock up lots of species just from that one group. There's a maximum of 20 from any one. And the whole purpose of this is to try and encourage and facilitate people to look more widely at the natural world and develop their own skills and interests, and gradually just become more aware of what's around us. So can I get on to tonight's theme of spring flowers? For those of you that have signed up to the 100 species, we have a whole series of ID guides. This is just a small clip from the Woodland Wildflowers. I've just picked this one out because there's a bit of overlap between this guide and what we're going to talk about tonight. So if you do sign up, then you have free access to all of these guides. And as you can see, they give you both some images of what they look like and a little bit of description. And also, crucially, what the similar species are. When it comes to identification, if you're not familiar with the group, the biggest challenge is not knowing what else might look like that species. So you might think, oh, well, I found a red campion, it looks exactly like that. But what happens if it was a little pinker? Is it still red campion? And so we've tried to give you some guidance on what it could be confused with. So when it comes to spring flowers, I always think now's a really good time to start developing your skills in identifying flora. You don't want to start in the middle of summer because you just get overwhelmed by so many species. So the earlier you start, the better. In fact, there's no reason to start for spring. You could start in winter. The BSBI, the Botanical Society of the British Isles, undertake an annual wildflower search on New Year's Day. And I think this year they found 57 species in flower. So there's, any time of year you can find wildflowers that are in flower, but it tends to be the kind of commoner ones that you find in flower all year round. And they're always the best ones to start with because you see them regularly. And so you're constantly reminded of them. So if you can, I always recommend people you start with the commonest species. So if you're going to get into flowers, what do you need? Really recommend that you get a field guide. Now there's a whole range of wildflower field guides out there. This is possibly one of the most comprehensive. It includes grasses and trees and the like. So it's, one purchase, it gives you kind of a lot of support. It is quite thick and heavy. So you question really with some of these field guides how transportable they are, but it's a good book to have, and it's not too expensive. In fact, I saw it the other day. One of the booksellers has had it on offer for £9.99, which was a bit of a bargain. The other thing which I'd recommend you get is a hand lens. A lot of the features that you need to look at can be quite small. For example, the types of hairs on different parts of the plant. So having a hand lens just makes the whole procedure of looking in detail that bit easier, and you can just do it in the field while you're out there. There are, of course, lots of free resources available. I've mentioned the ID guides on NatureSpot. If you just Google a lot of any species that you find, you'll see loads of pictures, and you'll probably be directed to a number of websites. So I always find it useful if you've identified something that's new to you, try and look at as many pictures of it as possible. Look at it from the different variants, different times of year. Obviously, plants change hugely. They're growing from the beginning of the year. Some of them flower before they produce leaves. Sometimes the other way around. Obviously, they're easier to identify when they have flowers, but with experience, you can identify most plants just from their leaves and their vegetation. So the more familiar you get with these plants, the easier it is to identify. I always like learning and finding new species, because I feel it's a bit like making new friends. Every species is unique. It's got its own life story, and it's kind of one of the definitions of what makes a species is that it is unique ecologically. It doesn't fulfill the same ecological niche as any other species. Sometimes they're quite similar, and it's not always clear. what the differences are, but that is always the case. There's always something unique about it, and it could be where you find them. You know, the habitat preference. Some prefer different types of soil or different amounts of light. The others flower at different times, take advantage of different pollinators, perhaps. Some are very specific in the types of pollinator they're trying to attract. It could be just long-tongued bees, for example. Others are more generalists. They don't really care which insects or pollinator visits them. So a lot of these things are reflected in the plant and its structure. Interestingly, there's quite a few differences in the way that they reproduce. For example, the two pictures I put up contrast that very much. On the bottom left, we've got groundsill, which is one of those that you can find flowering all year round, and it produces a kind of dandelion type clock seed head, as you can see there, and it just casts its seeds in huge quantities out into the wind, and they just travel everywhere, and it's one of its successes. The wood anemone on the top right, on the other hand, spreads mainly vegetatively, so it's a very slow, expansive species. And we'll come and look at that in a little bit more detail later on. You know, growth habit, you know, and also environmental tolerances. Some can tolerate dry soils, some need wet soils, and so on. So these are just a few of the factors that distinguish different plants. And sometimes as you become more familiar with a certain type of habitat, you get to know the types of plants that you're going to find there, and that narrows down the search for the species. So I'm going to look at two main habitats. I'm going to start with woodland, because in many ways they are the kind of archetypal spring wildflowers. And then we'll move on and look at what you might refer to as weeds, really, or many people would. I don't like that word. Colonizers, perhaps, is an alternative. But plants that are very successful at spreading themselves widely, and they just turn up everywhere. And as we'll look at, they're probably in your garden, they're outside your house. They're very easy to find, so they're good species to get to know. So we're going to look at 5 woodland plants and look at where they have similar species that you could confuse them with, and we'll explore how you tell them apart. One of the reasons woodland flowers flower early, and you may be aware of this, is they have to take advantage of the light before the trees come into leaf. So they've got this sort of window of when it's warm enough and light enough for them to grow, which is probably from the end of February, beginning of March in most cases. And then they've got to kind of do their whole life story in most cases before the trees come into leaf and cast dense shade in some cases by the middle end of May. And one of the ways they do this is by storing energy underground, because they haven't got enough time, like most plants do, to put 1 or 2 leaves out, to photosynthesize and collect energy from the sun and use that to fuel new growth. It takes all season to do that, and woodland plants haven't got that amount of time. So in the case of bluebells, for example, they have a bulb. The bulb is like a battery. It stores all of these resources. And so when the right environmental factors, a combination of temperature and day length, trigger the growth, the bulb then produces the energy and the food to allow it to push out lots of leaves and ultimately flower very quickly. And then it does what it can in the rest of the year to recharge that battery. Although the flower dies, the leaves will persist and it will collect what light it can, and hopefully it will store up enough energy both to repeat the process next year, but also then to reproduce vegetatively. And most of these other plants do something similar. They don't all have bulbs, but they also have rhizomes, which are like thickened roots, which also store resources. So let's start with the bluebell. Britain, as you may know, is the world leader in bluebells. We have more bluebell habitat than any other country in the world. They're a bit of a kind of Goldilocks species. They don't like it too cold and they don't like it too hot, and they find it just right in Britain, where we're kind of sheltered from the really deep cold that continental countries get, and but we're not bait in summer either. And I'm sure you're all familiar with kind of the big spread of bluebells across the woodlands. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to bring up one of the species that is quite a threat now to English native bluebells. It started off as garden Spanish bluebell, which escaped out of gardens and started to spread into the countryside. And then what's happened is that the Spanish bluebell has hybridized with the English bluebell. And so they reckon there's hardly any purebred Spanish bluebells out there anymore. They're nearly all hybrids of one kind or another. And in some woodlands, you will only find hybrid bluebells. So you have to be really careful when it comes to identifying these accurately. So the native bluebell, if you look in the top left there, you'll see, first of all, the flowers are very tubular, and then the petals at the end curl right back, very curled, and the anthers, the male parts that are just sticking out the tip of the flower, are a kind of a creamy white. You can see them on the top right as well. So, and also the leaves are very thin. They're very kind of strap-like, no more usually than a centimetre in diameter. So you have to look for that kind of combination of features to be pretty sure you're looking at an English bluebell and not a hybrid. The pictures I've put down at the bottom under the hybrid bluebell are more towards the Spanish bluebell end of the hybridization scale. The flowers, if you look carefully, are more bell-shaped. They're not so conical. The anthers are blue, a bluey white, not a creamy white. And the leaves are much broader. If you do come to Night and Spinney on Saturday, you'll see lots of hybrid bluebells. The leaves are very, very broad on the ones in Night and Spinney. And the trouble with hybrids is that you get quite a range. So it's actually not the easiest species to identify for sure, because of the hybrid can look a little bit more like the English bluebell or more like the Spanish bluebell. But if you can bear those factors in mind, you should be okay. Another very typical woodland plant, and you find this quite commonly under hedgerows as well, wherever there's a bit of shade, is lords and ladies. It's a very unusual plant in that it produces this very odd flower. It produces this kind of, it's almost like a white cowl that comes over, and it wraps over what is called a spathe, this brown drumstick thing in the middle here. And that produces a smell a bit like rotting meat that's attractive to flies, and flies are the main pollinators. And it has a very kind of clever way of actually trapping the flies at the base of the flower overnight and forcing them to wriggle around and collect pollen. And then it releases them in the morning so they can fly off to another lords and ladies plant and hopefully transfer the pollen. And then later in the year, all the leaves and the flowers die back, and all you're left with are these little kind of lollipop sticks coming out the ground with berries on them. You may have seen them. So what could you confuse this one with? Well, there is unfortunately another garden variety, the Italian lords and ladies, which is also quite widespread in certain areas. It has bigger leaves. Most of them are marbled, as you can see in this picture, but within the flower, the spathe is yellow rather than brown. You can even tell them apart if you're just looking at the berries, because it produces a much bigger stick of berries. It's always a little subjective, I think, when the comparator is, oh, it's bigger. Well, it's easy if you've got the two side by side, but not always that easy if you haven't. But like a lot of things, if you keep looking and get more familiar with them, you'll become quite familiar with it. So the next one, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is the violets. And the commonest violet that you'll find in woodland is the dog violet. But there are two others that you could potentially confuse it with. And again, I'll bring these up because it's easier to compare them. They all have similar leaves. The sweet violet leaves are more round, but they have kind of heart-shaped leaves on long stalks. But the key is that although they have a very similar looking flower, if you look at the spur, the bit of the flower that sticks out the back. Now with dog violet, it's usually paler than the rest of the petals. You'll see on the other two, it's either the same color or even darker. But also, if you look on top of this spur, the dog violet's got a little groove. You can see it here in this picture. And that's the only violet that has that groove in it. This is where you need a hand lens to help you spot it. It's not always easy to see, particularly when the stalk is looped over the top of it. The early dog violet is much less common, but is found early in the year and is worth looking for. And as I say, it has a spur that is darker. But the other difference are these sepals. The sepals are not petals. It's basically the part of the flower that was effectively the bud. It enclosed the bud. So when the flower bursts out, the bits that left, the bud casings, which are the sepals, and they're a different shape in these three species. They're very long, thin, and pointed in the dog violet, broader and less pointed in the early dog violet, and in the sweet violet, they're almost rounded, quite fat looking. The other thing to bear in mind with the sweet violet, as the name suggests, it's got a nice smell, a nice odor. In fact, the reason the others are called dog violets is because they don't smell and they're not as attractive as the sweet smelling ones. But it's worth looking out for the early dog violet because it's under-recorded because people are not sure how to identify it. So the combination, as I say, of the dark spur and the fatter, less pointed sepal is what you're looking for. The other thing with sweet violet, it forms big patches. So if you find an area that's got lots of plants all crowded together, and if you look closely, they're all attached with runners, then it'll be the sweet violet. So let's come back to our old friend, the wood anemone, kind of the archetypal woodland spring flower. As Sam mentioned, it's absolutely looking fantastic at the moment in Night and Spinney. Reason to go there, if nothing else, just to see the amazing show that's being put on. But it's a very low growing plant. It forms carpets along the ground, only grows a few centimeters up. It has these lovely white flowers that are kind of often pink on the outside. Like many flowers, they often close up in the afternoon. This is to kind of protect both the flower itself, but also the nectar and the pollen. I think they probably get most visits from pollinators in the morning, so that is the most efficient way of producing their nectar. Also, you have to remember that flowers, it takes them time and energy to produce nectar. So when a bee or another pollinator has been and had a good drink, there isn't necessarily any nectar left in the plant, and it has to spend time rebuilding that reservoir, and that can take quite some time. So it needs a bit of a rest to do that, and that might be one of the reasons why these flowers close up. Yeah, the other thing to notice is that the leaves, it looks like it's got 3 leaves. It's actually one leaf that's divided into 3. They're called leaflets. You find this quite commonly on many many plants. And it forms patches, as we said, because it spreads vegetatively, thanks to the rhizomes, these thickened roots that give it the energy to spread out. Now, another plant I've focused on is dog's Mercury. It's not a very spectacular plant, but it is very common in woodlands, and indeed it can absolutely carpet woodlands as the year goes on. So it's one that is useful to get to know. It produces these very small yellow flowers, and it grows about 20 to 30 centimeters high, so below knee height on the whole, but can produce all these carpets, as we've said, to the point where it can actually shade out and outcompete many other plants because it kind of takes over. Each individual plant, it doesn't branch. So if you have a good look, it's just a single stem coming out of the ground with leaves off that stem and the flower on the top. It does have a potential confusion plant, which also spreads quite widely in woodlands, but it's not really a spring flower, so you don't see it this time of year. But if you go into a woodland in July, you may well see big areas of enchanter's nightshade, which look broadly similar. They have very delicate little white flowers, and the other difference is that they produce these seeds that have kind of got a kind of Velcro covering, lots of little hooks, which is clearly designed to kind of catch on to passing animals or humans for that matter, to help spread the seeds far and wide. So let's move habitats now to these little kind of weedy areas. Edges of pavements and roads are great areas to look for them. And most of these plants that we're going to look for are out in flower now. So there's 5 that I'm going to focus on. They're all crucifers. Crucifers is a family of plants that gets its name from having 4 petals in a cross, hence the name. And they all produce pods, seed pods, and it's actually the seed pods that make them easier to identify than the flowers. And so we'll look at them individually, then we'll come back and look at this slide again to compare the pods. So one of the kind of commonest flowers around, and it doesn't just flower in spring, it will carry on flowering all year round, is the hairy bittercress. And so you've probably got it in your garden. If not, you'll have it outside your garden gate, no doubt. One to look for, it doesn't grow very big, maybe 10 to 20 centimeters tall. It has a basal rosette. Most crucifers do. So these are leaves that spread out in like a saucer shape on the ground with the flower stem coming out the center. And it has small white flowers. And then once it's produced the seeds develop in these pods, and they all point upwards, as you can see here. There is another bittercress that looks very similar, the wavy bittercress, but the wavy bittercress likes damp ground, so you tend to find it in ditches or damp woodland or by ponds, marshy areas. You wouldn't find it normally on the roadside. So one of the easiest ways to tell them apart, the surefire way, is to actually look at the stamens. So these are these little drumsticks here that are sticking up. There's 4 on the hairy bittercress, but there's 6 on the wavy bittercress. So again, that's why you need a hand lens, and they're normally pretty easy to see. There can be a difference in the way the pods arise on wavy bittercress. The pods tend not to rise so high, but again, that's a subjective character. The definite one to look for is to count the number of stamens. So another really common wildflower that you'll find everywhere is shepherd's purse. so called because the seed pods in this case have this heart shape. I don't know why shepherds traditionally had purses shaped like a heart, but that's, I guess, where it gets its name from. Again, they produce a kind of basal rosette of leaves and just a fairly plain 4-petaled flower, and just grow in the gutter everywhere. You'll find those, as I say, very easily, but the pods are unlike almost anything else. There's not another plant that you would confuse this with if you find the seed pod, so that's an easy one to identify. Another one that's out at the moment, it's definitely a spring flower, and will kind of disappear in a month or two's time, is thale cress. Again, starts off with the central rosette. Now in this case, it grows a very tall, thin stem. It's very spindly looking. And this time the pods are pushed out to the side. If you remember on the bittercress, they went vertically up, higher than the flower. This is like it's sticking its arms out sideways. But you'll notice it, I think, if you look for this very spindly growth. And finally, I perhaps should have started with this one because this is possibly the earliest one to flower in the year of almost any flower. It's called common Whitlow-grass. I don't know why it's called grass. I tried to find out, but I couldn't find an explanation. It's not a grass at all. There's one or two plants that have got grass in their name, so it can be a bit misleading. This looks like it's got 8 petals. It hasn't, it's got 4, but each petal is deeply divided down the middle, so it's pretending to have 8. This time the pods are round, and once they've dried out, there's one here, they look a little bit like kind of miniature honesty. If you're familiar with honesty, you know, the plant, it produces those paper-like round seed pods when they're dried out. This does the same, but on a much smaller scale. It only grows a few centimeters high, including the flower, but it can produce kind of carpet. It's harder to find now because it's being overshadowed by some of the bigger plants, and it's not flowering anymore, but it still has its seed pods. So you can find these round seed pods on very, very short plants. The other one, the last one I wanted to look at today, you can spot this one whilst you're driving around without really looking for plants at all. It lines increasingly many of our busy roadways. It's Danish Scurvy-grass, another one with grass in the name. Now this is a coastal plant that has, in the last decade or so, started to expand inland. And it's a coastal plant because it's tolerant of salt. On the coast, when the winds blow, it blows in salt spray, which coats the ground. And so anything that isn't salt tolerant struggles to survive. And so because of the salting of roads to protect them from icing, the salt gets spread onto the edge of the verge. And so most plants, non-coastal plants can't survive that. So there's effectively a bare strip along the edge of the road. And the Danish Scurvy-grass exploits that. It doesn't have any real competition, well, not much anyway. And you just see these long white trails, very narrow trails of blossom at this time of year alongside most of the roads. They're very, very common in Leicester, but any busy road really that's salted, you will find them. If you do look closely at this one, you'll see that it, like many coastal plants, it has quite thick rubbery leaves, and this is to help it to reduce desiccation from all of the salt. So you can recognize this one when it's finished flowering because of those leaves. There's nothing really much else that has the small kind of heart-shaped but leathery leaves. So just to bring them together again in terms of the pods. So the hairy bittercress has very upright pods, shepherd's purse has heart-shaped pods, thailcress has arms out to the side pods, and common Whitlow-grass has rounded pods that look a little bit like miniature honesty when they're dried. And Danish Scurvy-grass you can just recognize because it covers the edges of roads. There's two other spring flowers that I thought we couldn't leave out. These are both yellow plants that are very common from kind of February, early March onwards, but they're still around now. Lesser celandine can form huge carpets in shady areas, particularly under hedgerows as well as in woodlands. Has these kind of heart-shaped leaves, again quite glossy leaves, and yellow, I suppose, buttercup-like flowers. It's very low growing. It's not like buttercups that will grow higher. It's only growing a few centimeters up. But the glossy leaves make it different to most other plants as well that you're likely to see in that area. And the other plant on the right is kind of finished flowering now, but is still around as a flower or as a seed pod. It produces dandelion-like clocks. It's in the same family as dandelions as a seed pod, but it has these kind of drooping flower heads, and also has these scales along the flower stalk, which once you see them, there's nothing much else that you would confuse it with. And as the flowers die off, the leaves come into their own. So from summer onwards, you will find the leaves, but none of the flowers. So this is where it gets its name from. It looks like the foot of a horse. They kind of that roughly kind of horseshoe shaped, I suppose. And they're quite big. They can be size of your hand. So you can recognize them both from the flower and also from the leaves. So just a few words about recording, not just spring flowers, but any flowers. With all recording, do take photos. It's not just about recording, it's also to help you with identification. Because once you've taken a photo, you've got that kind of reference, you've captured it, and you can then share them around, you put them on the next spot forum, or if you know somebody that knows a bit more about wildflowers, you could email them the picture and try and get some help that way. But as we mentioned at the beginning, flowers have this nasty habit of changing their shape through the season. So, and also different features can be critical to distinguish one similar flower from another. So these are kind of things to try and take pictures of. So the basal leaves, we've seen some of those little kind of crucifers that have a basal rosette. The leaves in the basal rosette can often be quite different to the leaves that are on the stem. So if you just took one leaf picture, it may not be that helpful. So take pictures of both. Sometimes stem hairs can be kind of critical. Is it hairy? Is it not? Do the hairs stick out sideways, or are they pressed up to the stem? Most people, when they're taking pictures of flowers, take the pictures looking down on the flower. It's actually much more helpful to take a sideways shot. For example, you saw on the violets, you can then see the sepals and the shape of those. So try and take a picture of the flower sideways on. If it's got seeds, or seed pods, take a picture of those. And then a picture of the flower in its habitat. Often the habitat is quite critical. And then if you're putting it onto next spot and you've chosen your species, here is the row where I've chosen hairy bittercress, you could write in the comments box the critical ID feature. So the fact that it had 4 stamens, which I'm sure you'll have looked at and identified. And that just helps give that little bit more confidence to the person checking the record that it is hairy bittercress if it's not clear from the picture. So I'm going to stop there. If anybody has any questions, you're very welcome to ask them. You'll have to remember to unmute yourself. to ask any questions. Okay. Okay, well, if there's no questions, then I'll just again really welcome you to join me on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock at Knighton Park, where we're going to go around Knighton Spinney. We'll see lots of these plants that we just looked at now, plus many, many others. So hopefully, if you are wanting to learn a little bit more about flowers, this could be a good opportunity to kind of get some hands-on experience.
Dave, I think Nicola has a question.
Yeah, fire away, Nicola.
Just for the Saturday walk, is it? I don't know Knighton Park. Is it obvious where you're going to meet up? The meeting point?
Yes, it's the kind of the main car park. So if you go up the ring road, there's a signpost into the park.
Yeah.
It's right next to Knighton Spinney as well, if you need that. So yeah, you'll approach it from the ring road, go past the Spinney, and it's immediately on your right.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all for attending. We are recording this, so I will put the link onto NatureSpot, and I'll send it to Sam as well. So if anybody wants to look at any of these slides again, you'd be very welcome to have a look. And as I said, if you sign up for the 100 Species Challenge, you can then access the ID guides, which will give you a lot of this kind of information and cover a whole range of other species. So I hope to see you on Saturday. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dave. That was really, really informative. And if anybody's interested in more information about the Saffron Brook project more generally, please do contact us as well. And thank you all for attending.